Thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. I know it's rainy, and welcome to sunny Munich. Last time I was here, it was sunny but cold, but thank you for coming out because we have an amazing panel tonight. We're very excited to talk to you. And for those of you watching from home, I'm sorry that you don't get one of our lovely swag bags, but for those of us in our audience, please be sure to grab one on your way out. This, of course, is a collaboration between the One Decision podcast and Berlin Briefing. And if you notice, the leaders on our panel tonight have one thing in common, because as the great poet laureate Beyonce once said, who run the world? Well, not girls, but these badass women we have in front of us. And given what's going on in the world and uncertain times, we wanted to gather these women together and talk about not only global issues and foreign affairs, but whether more women's leadership and leadership of a different kind, apart from this kind of macho, bravado, unitarianism we've got going on, unilateralism, excuse me, can be kind of the antidote to what's happening. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nina to introduce herself and the rest of our panel.
Hi, yeah, thanks very much for turning up here. Exciting times, of course, in the world, also in Germany, 10 days away from elections. And of course, I do have to say that we noticed what happened today in Munich as well, the incident. So this has also shaken a lot of people, and it's part of a reality that nobody enjoys. But we've got a great panel. We've got lots to discuss. And our focus tonight, I think, is going to be on European female leaders' reaction to the latest announcements from Donald Trump respecting his phone call to Vladimir Putin, saying that the conflict can be ended, but does that mean peace? We've got the foreign minister of Latvia here with us, who has a very clear opinion on this question. And also, Baiba has to leave at 8 o'clock. So thank you very much for coming here, making this time. Really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Also, we have got Thordis Gylfadottir here, who's Iceland's former foreign minister and has now taken up a new role as special envoy for the Council of Europe for the children of Ukraine. So that is definitely something where she will be busy. And Kajsa Ollongren, thanks very much for joining us from the Netherlands, former Dutch defense minister. So lots of questions for you as well in terms of where is Europe going to go with all these latest announcements.
I am definitely the least qualified person on this stage, but thank you for letting me join you anyway.
Yeah, and so we'll have about an hour to discuss things, and after that, we'll have a reception here for more talk about serious and hopefully also not so serious issues, because we also need some entertaining things occasionally.
Levity is important.
Yes.
In these trying times.
Yes. So. Okay, but let's dive in, because everybody wants to know from you, how did you react when you learned about Donald Trump calling Vladimir Putin and then informing Volodymyr Zelenskyy that he was going to start negotiations?
I was on the way to a live TV interview, actually. So I learned about it 5 minutes before being interviewed. And but our position has been very clear, and I think it's very like-minded across all the allies in NATO and beyond. We all want peace. Nobody wants war, and it can be stopped pretty easily if Putin stops war. That is not happening. Whether this will actually lead to something, we will see. For now, the only things that we are seeing is more Russian attacks and all the instruments of power within Russia geared towards war. There is not one single indicator that they are changing anything. The economy is a war economy, the politics, religion, media, private sector. I mean, it's authoritarian regime imprisoning lawyers of opponents. So it's not like suddenly something has changed. And therefore, yes, we all want peace, but it has to be peace with Ukrainian agency, on Ukrainian very clear understanding, but also peace that doesn't affect negatively or adversely other countries' security. And here I speak, of course, about those countries from Norway to the Baltics, Poland, and so on, who are actually on Russia's borders. And, whatever arrangements we have afterwards, they have to be strong enough to ensure that Russia, which is an official threat, as recognized by all the allies, thanks to the defense ministers and the foreign ministers and our leaders, that Russia that is a threat actually stays within its own borders and actually is not restarting hostilities elsewhere. And for that, there are obviously certain things that need to be done. Russia has to be weakened on the battlefield. There have to be certain guardrails afterwards. We will never recognize occupation of Ukraine's territories. Ukrainian borders and territorial integrity in accordance with its international borders is sacrosanct. So there is a whole set of things that will be happening. But once it leads to actual peace, and it can lead to actual peace, it's of course what we all want. We want peace in Ukraine. We want Ukraine, strong, sovereign country, recovery, reconstruction, and everything. But to get there, from here to there has to be certain steps. So this is the beginning of the process we will see. And we also know that Putin's aim is actually change in European security architecture. He's been quite open about it in 21-22.
But is getting from there to here, and I'll open this up to everyone, is that now more difficult if you have American officials, including the American president, giving away some of those huge bargaining chips before negotiations have even really begun? If you're already saying Ukraine doesn't need to be part of NATO and no US forces, which would obviously make enforcing any kind of ceasefire really, really difficult, is it done before it's even gotten started?
Again, when Baltic states wanted to join the NATO, the first messages we were getting, no. It was a no to us. It only changed after 9/11, to tell you frankly, when it was a different geopolitical situation. So it doesn't mean that Ukraine has to give up its NATO aspirations. It's Ukrainian agencies. They can still maintain its objective, whether it becomes or not part of the outcome from the negotiations. I would separate that part from what Ukraine itself decides what is best for her. So I don't see that as giving something up. The same about the American troops in Ukraine. I mean, who is surprised about being that said in open? We all knew that was quite obvious. But it doesn't mean that there is no American support if there is international presence. That is a different thing. So there is a variety of ways to look at it. But again, prejudging something before the actual negotiations start, I would say it's too early. Last week with the Baltic ministers, we were in Washington and had long conversations there on the Hill, policymakers, also with General Kellogg. And it was very clear that General Kellogg is preparing options for the president to decide. And it will be president's decision and decision alone. And that was very clear, that nobody else is going to do that in his stead. So
not even Elon Musk?
So it's a beginning of the process. Who is that?
That's a very complicated question. I do not feel qualified to answer. Any other reaction from, what you're hearing out of the U.S. as far as these negotiations?
Yes, well, I happened also to be in Washington. We were attending the same event. And you do hear different things from Washington. But I must say it hasn't become easier yesterday and today when one president to another in a phone call and the report on that, you cannot just erase everything that we have talked about before, also in NATO with Ukraine, which is, of course, cooperation. We have a NATO-Ukraine Council. We have talked about the way forward.
Well, and the policy of the Biden administration in the last NATO summit that we were all at in Washington was saying pretty openly Ukraine should become a member of NATO.
Yeah, and I think we all said it's not the question if,
Correct.
but when. And of course, every NATO ally has to agree to membership. And we know that because when Sweden wanted to join, it took quite a long time because Turkey didn't agree. So that's all in the game. But saying on beforehand that it cannot be on the table also in negotiations, of course, is not something that we have seen before. And I think we have to be honest about that. And I think also I read today Kaja Kallas' reaction to this, and on behalf, of course, of the European Union, I think that was very fair. So to say if you want to start a process of negotiations towards peace, then you don't start by concessions to your opponents. Normally that's not what you do, because you know you're starting on a back foot. You're starting your game and you're 2-0 or 3-0 behind. So you're making it more difficult. But I think that was the main problem that I had with what I read yesterday and heard yesterday. That's really about the war in Ukraine and how to end the war in Ukraine. I wouldn't necessarily conclude that the US is less committed to NATO. But I do think if we don't get the right end of the war in Ukraine, it will weaken NATO, because it will send a sign to all autocrats in this world that might does make right, and that aggression against another country bordering your country, for whatever reason you have for that aggression, that it gets rewarded. And I think that's a very dangerous precedent, and I think we have to say that. And I was very glad to hear European reactions yesterday and today being critical of this path that President Trump has chosen.
Can I ask you, Kajsa, we've got the Ukraine contact group where essentially military aid to Ukraine is being coordinated from Germany, but it was run by the US until now. Then for the last meeting, it was the UK that ran it. What's the future of this particular group? Does anybody know? Is that going to still exist? Because it was quite helpful so that countries could actually talk to each other before sending certain weapons and say, okay, maybe it's a good idea for you to do this and I can do that because Ukraine's missing this. This is a vital forum. What's the future of that?
Well, I think it's a very practical group with over 50 countries. It was always led by the US. Biden administration was very keen on that. But since then, I think we have institutionalized certain things in coalitions where certain countries lead certain coalitions. For instance, Denmark and the Netherlands lead the F-16 coalition. You have artillery coalitions, you have all kinds of coalitions. And NATO has also taken on a bigger role in coordinating the aid. So I think also without the engagement of being the chairman, etc., this group can go on. And as I understand it, Hague hasn't said that they will stop their military aid to Ukraine immediately. And I think by anticipating the way that the group has, it will be able to continue.
Thordis, we haven't heard your reaction yet.
I'm in a position now where I'm not any longer a Minister for Foreign Affairs, so that might leave me in a position to speak a bit more freely than when you're in that position. And I can only say that I do worry. I think that, there are not many things in a very complicated world when it comes to geopolitics that are black or white, but the full-scale invasion is one of those things. And Ukraine has, who wants peace more than Ukraine, than the Ukrainian people? They have been dying for that, and not only for the internationally recognized borders, but also for the society that they have already chosen to build. And that's not a mafia-run, Russia. That's a different kind of society. And when has Russia shown that they value peace and human life? I mean, it was not, in 2014. It was not with airplanes. It was not in Bucha. It was not yesterday when they were bombing Kyiv. So it's, of course, you worry. And even though, when time passes, the news gets, lower on the list and people get tired and all of those phrases that we know very well. But it does worry me that the talking points and the lines that, now we just should negotiate peace, even without Ukraine. We should say beforehand that they will never become a part of NATO. But still, we're going to ensure that there will be peace there. How? I mean, the NATO umbrella is obviously the best thing to secure that. And if you're a country that is independent and sovereign with internationally recognized borders, you should be able to choose your future. And that also means you should be able to choose, if they want to belong in NATO, they should be able to do that. And they have already said that. So, of course, the new administration, they want to come out as strong men and doing a good deal. And I know that there was or is some sort of, in certain groups, optimism that this would somehow disrupt this new administration and the new scenario would disrupt the situation now, and what could that mean? And I mean, one can hope that that will mean something good. But what we're hearing isn't really that when, the President of the United States has a very long and fruitful and positive conversation with Putin, and they're going to visit each other and they're going to figure this out. So I agree. I listened to Kaja Kallas today, and I mean, I agreed with every word she said. And for me, that should be the line of friends and allies. Not only friends and allies of Ukraine, but literally friends and allies of democracy and individual human rights and some rule-based international system, because it all connects.
Let me ask you then, and we'll start and we can go down with Foreign Minister. Is the U.S. in its current state a reliable friend and ally? Can you count on the U.S. to follow through with policies that have been made in the last administration and the current administration? Do you find the U.S. to be a reliable ally in this year?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And we got the reconfirmation of that last week in Washington from everywhere. The Senate, the House, the administration. So it's pretty straightforward. Also, I got the readout from defense ministers today, and,
So despite what you're hearing, you're not concerned?
The messages of strong NATO is there. The messages of full trust in NATO are there. Whether US wants Europe to take more responsibility, but also to put more resources in defense. Oh, yes, but that's what we want in the Baltics also. We are moving towards 5% of GDP for defense, which was all right, for quite a number of countries in the Cold War times. And currently, Europe, of course, has grown very attached to certain benefits that we all have. And, it's very difficult to sort of go back into the crisis mode. But that is a necessity. That is a necessity. We need to be able to have the forces, to have the capabilities, to have the deterrence, to have, if necessary, ability to defend. NATO is not an attack dog. NATO is a defense alliance. It's political military alliance. But to enable our military to do their functions, they need resources. They need those capabilities. And that is what political leaders have asked them to do. And they say, okay, they have come back and said, okay, this is actually, what we need, and this is going to cost money. So, and I think as political leaders, it's the obligation of European leaders to step up and do that.
But do you all have confidence that if there were a need for NATO to invoke Article 5, that America, this current America, would come defend Europe? Do you still have faith in Article 5 under the Trump administration?
America doesn't have to come anywhere. America is in Europe. American forces are everywhere. Supreme Allied Commander is American general, and he has two hats, European command of the US and NATO's troops. The Allied troops have already been under the transfer of authority given under Secure's command. So, there's what has been done already so that if necessary, Secure, seeing certain indicators, if he needs to move forces, he can do that without allies sitting around the table in Brussels. But again, that's why our military leaders have come back to political leaders and said, okay, actually, the situation is serious, and this is a threat assessment, and this is what we have agreed, and these are the plans and the forces and the exercise, and this is a posture and prepositioning and everything that we need. So it's time to deliver. And it's around 3.5% across the alliance, actually. So it's not even 5% of GDP everywhere, but across the alliance on average. So I just think US is totally right. And also the same concerns more energy independence for Europe. I'm sorry. Seeing that Russian LNG share in European imports is rising is like, are we serious? What are we talking about, really? And the prices in Europe are still so high. American LNG is cheaper.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a real alliance also there, energy alliance that needs to be built with the US. So that was part of our messages last week in Washington also. Okay, we want to buy more US gas, more US diesel, more US stuff in the Baltics, but let's do it together across Europe because that is a strategic objective.
But Baiba, before you have to go, can I just ask you the question?
It came up fast.
Because you're saying you agree with what the Americans are saying about the goal of stepping up European defense budgets, and it's something that we've heard from the Baltic countries in particular for a very long time, that other European countries are not essentially investing enough money into this. But how is Europe going to take part in the negotiations? Isn't that something where you have got criticism for the Trump administration? This phone call where Donald Trump calls Vladimir Putin and then informs Zelenskyy, and everybody else in Europe learns about it in the press. Is that something that you can support? And if you can't, how does Europe take part in these negotiations? How do you get in?
I think we all in Europe have been very clear that Europe has to be part of the negotiation process. Who is that is the next question, and that's $1 million question, as we all know. And but I won't go into it. But yes, Europe, because again, it's a peace in Europe. It's the interests of European countries. We in the Northeast, of course, together with Finns and all the others, we have been, in touch throughout the process. You know how it is with Nordic Baltic ministers and our conversations that are ongoing. So there is very clear understanding, yes, that there is a role for Europe. How to do that and who is going to do that, as I said, I don't want currently to go into it, but I'm sure that we could get that decision.
And we know you have to run, so thank you so much for joining us. And if we could all applaud a very dramatic exit. Thank you all so much. Safe travels. All right, I want to circle back. Do the two of you have faith in Article 5? And is the US a reliable ally to its European and other allies around the world?
I want to believe that the US is a reliable ally and will continue to be. I mean, the US is the most important ally to each and every European country. That's a fact, and that has been the way for a very long time. I also believe, the United States are an amazing country. It's, the history, the fundamental values, how it's built, the strength of it, the checks and balance, all the way from 250 years ago, and even during that time, they did a good job in protecting checks and balance, and they did not agree on everything, but they did agree that they didn't want a king. So I want to believe that the system in the US is strong enough and has the will and the power to continue to be the leader of the free world. And I believe it can be if it wants to. And when you look at the whole system, what I see is a will to continue to be that. But each and every, you could almost say days and definitely weeks, the development is quite fast and it's a bit chaotic. So, it's difficult to say where we will be in 6 months' time or 12 months' time. But, the last 80 years, the US has been the strongest player. And I just can't see a reality where the US would decide that they don't want to be the strongest player, that they don't want to have the power they've had and can continue to have, and their soft power is also power, and that's something that worries me if they still look at soft power as real power.
Kajsa?
Well, I haven't heard that the Trump administration is saying that their commitment to NATO is less. So they're in NATO, and NATO has an Article 5, and NATO is based on the trust that if Article 5 is triggered, they are their allies.
That's like the whole NATO thing.
That's the whole NATO thing. And when it was triggered by the United States at the time in 9/11, it worked.
Yeah.
So I'm not hearing any of that. But what I am hearing is that they want a different division of labor within NATO. And there I agree also with our Latvian friend that Europe must step up. Europe must do more for its own security. That's not strange to ask. And not only Trump, but others have asked for it for a long time. And we have to live up to that expectation. Europe has to be responsible for more of its own security within the NATO framework.
This was a big pet peeve of Obama as well. He just was less loud about it and less upfront about it. But my understanding is behind the scenes, he was pretty upset about this as well.
Yes, exactly. So, and then in 2014, we agreed we have to grow towards those 2%, the 2% in 2024. Then we had, of course, to speed things up because the full-scale war in Ukraine started. But so I think that is something we can agree on. And but the whole division of labor thing is a different question, because that is a mindset where the United States says, we are expecting more of engagement in the Indo-Pacific. We will take care of that, but you take care of Europe. And that we have never discussed it in those terms before. And that is something we have to really think through because, like I said, there Ukraine comes in. If the war in Ukraine ends badly for Ukraine and for Europe, that increases the possibility that there will be some kind of trouble also in the Indo-Pacific. And that's not what the Americans want, I think. So I hope will be room for this discussion. And that also Trump will not want to reward Putin for that type of aggression, saying that he doesn't encourage wars in general. But you don't know if there is much room for that type of debate because of the way that this new administration acts.
But Kajsa, can I just ask, if Europe wants to take part in the negotiations, then clearly Europe needs to speak with one voice. I mean, you're sitting here, and also Baiba Braze is sitting here and saying Europe needs to do more in terms of defense spending. At the same time, we've got lots of countries, especially in Europe, where voters don't see it that way, and governments are struggling. How united is Europe at the moment? Because if Donald Trump has to take Europe seriously, then Europe needs to be able to speak with one voice. How united is Europe?
Well, Europe, what Europe we're talking about? We're talking about the European Union. We're talking about Europe as a continent, because I think when it comes to Ukraine and peace in Ukraine, you always want to include the UK, very important player, I think, in this. Norway, NATO allies that are not in the European Union. And of course, Europe struggles to speak with one voice. Also the European Union. We're 27 countries. We have 27 parliaments. We have elections everywhere, every time. We have different coalitions. We have all kinds of different... But I think that's not what's important. What is important is that overall we are united on wanting to have a secure Europe for our citizens. And I think we are. You've seen it in almost all countries. We've reached the 2%. We have new goals and targets for defense spending over the whole political, from left to right. At least, let's say, a little bit left of center, right of center, we are in violent agreement on that we have to increase defense spending because we want a secure future for ourselves and for our children. So I think we should be able to speak with one voice. We can. When there's a crisis, Europe can act. We've seen it in the COVID pandemic. We've seen it during the financial crisis, something that is forgotten, but it's also an example of where Europe did act as one. With one voice, so this can be overcome. So I'm not so worried about that we cannot. If there is a negotiation, we will find a way for Europe to attend it. Let's first get Ukraine at the table, and Ukraine will insist on having Europe there, and then we'll figure out who it has to be.
We're going to shift topics, Thordis, unless you want to add something to that.
No, I don't think so. Okay. I agree with everything she said, basically.
Well, that was very accommodating.
So united.
I want to talk a little bit about the state of democracies around the world, and this lack of faith in institutions. And this is something you're seeing not just in the U.S. It's something you're seeing here in Germany. You're seeing it all across Europe. You know, the U.S. in particular, we've talked about this a little bit. If you look, you know, you're getting these career civil servants who are being dismissed from jobs at USAID. They're being dismissed from the FBI and all these agencies. And for me, the reaction is more telling than the act itself almost, because those actions are very popular with the president's supporters. And actually CBS News, my former employer, has a poll out this week that says President Trump has a 53% approval rating. And that's because people who don't work in Washington, D.C., who don't work in USAID, who don't work in these spheres don't really understand what these people do. So my question, Thordis, I want to start with you, is this a failure of government officials, not in one party or the other, across the board, to explain to populations what the government does for them, how it is functioning for them? Or is it simply that the government is not doing that and that's why people are so upset?
No, I think this is a key question and it's very complicated. And I still haven't really, got my head around it. Because, in general, I would say in, at least in, European welfare states, there is still quite a lot of trust, towards institutions and just within the societies. So you have resilient societies that trust the institutions, and that is key. And I think that to uphold that, you need to ensure the opportunities and the capacity of society to take care of one another. I think it's easier in those societies than in others.
Because people can see literally what the government is doing.
Yes, because they feel it, and they see that their peers that need assistance, they get some sort of assistance. But having said that, I'm also a politician that would say we do not want the government to do everything, and we have too complicated regulations on many stuff, and it is, at least in many countries, it's quite difficult to let a person go when it's working in the public sector, and that creates frustration because there are different rules between the private sector and the public sector. But now I'm rethinking all of that when you see when you're using that narrative to undermine institutions, because there's a big difference.
Because the narrative is they're full of these workers who aren't doing their jobs. They're corrupt, they're wasteful.
But I think part of the problem is that too much of that work is not as efficient as it should be. So I think, I'm not saying that it's right to do it. I'm just saying that if we could show that there's no waste in these institutions, it would be easier to, continue to have the support that it needs. And again, I think when we talk about, for example, freedom, and Timothy Snyder does this very well, often we talk about freedom as it's freedom from. So it's freedom from those institutions, it's freedom from the government, it's freedom from everything. But the real freedom is when you have a freedom, to do stuff that you have, and to be able to do that, you need strong institutions. And you need trust towards, courts and critical institutions. So if there's a strong society that has a plan to undermine institutions, then we have a real, problem. But I also think that, democracies are messy. They are chaotic. You have all the problems on the table and everyone has a voice and you can criticize everything. In autocratic states, you don't have that. They're just, they hide them. And then everything looks okay until it breaks. So it's democracies are more complicated, but it's the best thing we got, and it's way better than the alternatives. And I also think that politicians need to take their work more seriously. I think for too many regular voters, they look at politicians and they just don't connect with them. Many of them are too self-centered. They focus on things that don't really matter. And so I think this development has to lead to, we have to look at ourselves and ask, are we showing the right faces, or do we have enough politicians that are competent enough? I saw some tweet from Under Secretary of Home Diplomacy or something, and he said, "What the world needs is more competent white men to control. Then everything gets better," or something like that. I'm referring, and I agree with like 1/3 of that statement, which is we need more competence. We need competent people, and we need real courage and leadership, and I think we are lacking a bit of that.
Can I just to come back to that? Yeah, I mean, when you look at the role that social media is playing now in how institutions are being looked at by people, should Europe follow the example of Australia and say social media is only for people older than 16, because social media essentially pushes posts that work on rage, because rage is our strongest emotion. And you don't get enraged when you see a post by a competent person. Usually, you tend to see it's like
you're undermining everyone's business model with this suggestion.
No, but is that the way to go? How do we deal with the fact that Elon Musk is very, very active in the U.S. government?
Well, I think the reality of social media is a huge factor and a huge change, and again, there is quite different views within Europe and US on how to control that, and that again is a sensitive issue. And we talk about freedom of expression and free speech. But for me, it's not that complicated to say freedom of free speech and freedom of expression is a fundamental human right. Human rights are supposed to be for human beings. They are not for bots. So the fact that you can't have any rules on a new world that controls so much because it's a fundamental human right, it doesn't make any sense. And the longer we don't have any framework or rules on how to live in a world where you have these social media and misinformation and disinformation, that is undermining the democracies. So as the longer the democracies don't do anything about that, the good guys are not doing a great job on social media. The other guys are doing a better job. And it's true. I mean, lies and anger and hatred, it spreads 6 times faster than truth. But what spreads as fast as as those things, bad things, is actually inspiration. So that's also something for, at least the people that believe in fundamental human rights and those values these values are something worth fighting for. We should maybe, do a better job on those venues.
Thoughts? Anything you want to add either on faith in institutions or our lovely social media landscape?
Well, maybe on the institution part, because I think it is, what Musk seems to be doing in Washington, D.C., we still have to see if it holds.
Yes.
Because it's very interesting. Of course, there is a Congress. And he is a non-elected person who he only seems to have one boss, who is President Trump. But he's not really accountable to anybody, which makes it very complicated, I think. And I think there is in the Republican Party a strong support for to get rid of all kinds of things. But when you talk to them and you ask them for examples, so why do you have to get rid of almost everything of U.S. aid? They give examples of projects of $6 million in a country in South America promoting transgender rights. Well, I mean, if that's your problem, you don't have to get rid of whole of US aid, which is also supporting free speech in many countries, including Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova.
And American power. I mean, there's a soft power argument that doesn't seem to be factoring in, which is a bit confusing. But.
So that doesn't really make sense. So it can also be a sort of a shock and awe approach, and in a couple of months we will wake up and see that 60-70% of the staff is back and the budget's back in place. But we don't know at this moment. What scares me as a Democrat, as a European Democrat, is that it's so easy to put someone in this position who can just simply do as he feels like, as he likes. Without having the checks and balances in place at that moment. I think that in my country, in European countries, is quite unthinkable. Because their parliament would step in, or you would have a coalition, a majority that would not approve of this. And of course, we are different countries and different types of democracies. And there is this issue of a large group of people who are not happy or satisfied or worried or scared about things. But I think, and I can take my own country as an example, where also a populist party has become the largest party in our parliament. Doesn't have a majority, but it's the largest party. I think that people by now are seeing that voting for this party and even having them in government doesn't necessarily bring them the quick results that they want and expect. So if housing is an issue in your country, like in my country and in many countries, it's not an easy to solve problem. But it has to be done. But it has, you have to have perseverance, you have to have budget, you have to have good plans, and it's going to take 10 years. It's something that people have difficulty in accepting, which I understand if you are the person looking for that housing. But it's also a fact of life. And seeing now with populists in coalitions that they're not delivering on their promises, is hopefully going to make people think again when next time they can go and vote.
But that's the risky path, right, for all the European countries, because there are these two approaches, essentially. One approach is, okay, let them demystify themselves, let them get the power, and then people will see that they're useless when they're actually having to do something instead of just describing problems. And the other approach is, of course, to say, like the discussion that we're having here in Germany about potentially banning the far-right AfD party, because we can already see that some of their members have the inclination, they do want to change our system in a way that would completely get rid of democratic pillars. So that is a tricky path, I think, for Europe. And of course, by the time that US courts will have decided on Elon Musk and whether or not it's legal what he's doing, he will already have got access to all the data. How worrying is that?
Yeah, I think that is really worrying. I think at that point you would have to conclude that the checks and balances are not working. I think that's extremely dangerous. I mean, the intelligence services, that is very, very sensitive information. But coming back to your point, it's going to be different in every country. For in my country, my party didn't want to and has refused to cooperate with the populist. But other parties chose the other path. So it's going to be different in every country. And I think it's up to those politicians who really want to change things and make things better, and to make sure that people get the things that they need, that the societies need to make our economies function and our societies function, that they deliver on that, and that is the only way, and not to promise things that cannot be delivered.
But coming off your point about competency and your point about multilateralism and how these coalitions have to deliver for their people and democracy is messy. In the US, especially right now, there is this kind of knee-jerk reaction to, in some cases, the last administration, who was almost paralytically bureaucratic, wanting to use government, wanting to go through the steps and balances to the point where the perception for a lot of voters was nothing was getting done. So is the antidote to that changing the people who are in these offices, changing the people who are in these coalitions, having more women participate at all levels of government? We pulled a stat from the UN. According to the UN, 107 countries, including the US, have never had a woman head of state. In 2024, women held only 27% of seats in national parliaments and 35.5% of seats in local governments. And as we kind of lean into this bravado, bullying, autocratic style of leadership, is there another way to go about it? And can women help?
Iceland gave it a try, I think.
I mean, I think it's obvious that diversity and different kind of leadership would be a good idea. In Iceland, I mean, we were the first ones to democratically elect a president. Today, we have a prime minister that is a woman, foreign minister is a woman, Speaker of the Parliament is a woman, the bishop is a woman, the chief of police is a woman, the president is a woman. You know, I could continue. And
we've talked about me applying for Icelandic citizenship before.
Yeah, we've talked about that. No, but what I can say, you know, we're doing fine. It works. It's okay.
Show off.
So yes, I do believe that, you know, there is obviously a difference between, you know, men and women. But there are probably more difference within, you know, the women's sector and the men's sector than it is there in between. But I think with the world we live in now, I think it would be an excellent idea, a sensible idea and a smart idea to increase numbers of women in power. Because what comes with it is often new approach, different views, more compassion, more human approach somehow. And I think that is what we need. And I actually think when we're talking to, you know, voters and our publics, I think we more often need to be basically just more honest. Because there are too often show-offs. Like people are pretending they know it all, they're pretending they can fix stuff that they can't fix and they know it, but they still say it. And that is what also feeds, you know, populist parties, where they can then have, you know, very simplistic solutions for difficult and challenging things, instead of, you know, just say what you mean what you say, acknowledge when things are complicated, try to explain why, talk like a human being, don't like talk like a robot, and be a part of, you know, being a politician is you're offering to, you know, service something. You're there to increase quality of life or assisting in things that, you know, have to be done. And I think it would be, you know, why not? It's not like we, you know, have all the solutions with a method that we've used, you know, since the beginning of mankind. So it might be a good idea just to mix it up a bit and have more women.
Yes, well, of course, I was thinking about Iceland and then my own country, the Netherlands. Well, we did have a queen, but we now have a king again. We've never had
the UK.
Yes, exactly. We never had a female prime minister. So we still have a long way to go. But I agree, of course, it's better to have more of a mix in every way, young and old and men and women, etc., etc. But we do seem to be, in general, in the world, going a little bit backwards. And I think we have to acknowledge that as well. So why is that happening? Why in the United States, for instance, I think the current Secretary of Defense has said that he doesn't really see added value to women in the armed forces because women cannot fight. Well, I mean, if that is your view, you're going to have really a tough job. Because if I look at countries in Europe, we want to have more people in our military, in our armed forces. We cannot leave the half of the population out of that.
Or even close U.S. allies like Israel, where, you know, military service is compulsory for both genders.
Exactly, and there are many countries. And I've met lots of women in Ukraine who fight or who do the medical support on the front line. They couldn't fight this war without the women. So I think it is very strange to have this idea, which we should go back a couple of decades or even centuries, to exclude women from certain positions. But there is this tendency, and I think we have to be honest about that, and ask ourselves if there is, you know, are men feeling threatened by women in certain positions. okay, let's have that dialogue. Then why? Maybe we should do something about that instead of being opposed to one another. Because in general, I think everyone that I've worked with, men or women, would say that in a mixed team, you get better results, you get a better atmosphere, everything works better.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the fact that all the populist parties in Germany are run by women, which is very interesting because it leads us to the point of essentially saying we need diversity in age, and it is really not that much about gender, but when you look at the lack of diversity, especially in US politics, when it comes to the last presidential elections, we had 2 old men, and here in Germany as well, we have 2 men who are standing to be chancellor, who are the current one.
We did run a woman; she just didn't win.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, you changed from one man to the other old man. That's what I'm trying to say. It's the lack of diversity that is mind-boggling sometimes. But here in Germany, I was just struck thinking about Alice Weidel from the far-right AfD, and then Sarah Wagenknecht from the far-left BSW, and then Marine Le Pen, who is the leader in France. So I think we just need to be clear that it's not just man-woman. But of course, it can also serve the feminist foreign policy approach is something that Annalena Baerbock was, the German foreign minister, trying to push a lot. And she actually used it as an approach. She knew very well that there were lots of critics who said, okay, yeah, cute. Okay, nice, you're getting together with all your girls, haha. But she used it to get access to countries where otherwise she wouldn't have got access. She used, for example, the opportunity to talk about diversity and to talk about how wars affect children, families, etc., and how wars can be ended better if the women on the ground feel safe. If they don't feel safe, then no country is safe. That's what Annalena Baerbock used to say. And then she goes to a conference and talks about this topic and gets access to the South African, who she's been wanting to talk to for a long time. Right? So it's a very pragmatic approach, like you were saying, Thordis. It's something where, this is not going to be very popular in the next couple of years, I don't think. I can't see it. I don't know if you disagree.
No, unfortunately, I agree. I think that will, but I don't know. I mean, things are moving so fast. It's really difficult to vision or see where we will be in 6 months' time or in a year. So I don't know, if something could break that up, but at least we're going in that direction, and we see backlash in this. And I think I agree with you, unfortunately.
Okay, so we're in Munich. It's the Munich Security Conference, and you'll get lots of chances, of course, in those corridors to run into other women, but also men. Can you just, because we want to sort of end on a lighter note, don't we? Can you just tell us about some of the funnier encounters that you've had at the MSC, where you find yourself queuing behind somebody you've wanted to speak to for a long time? Because we all know that it's really packed there.
I can't really. When I'm visioning something awkward, that was the year when COVID was very aggressive, and we all had these very annoying, awful masks, and I really disliked that situation. This is the first time I'm arriving not as a minister, which means fewer bilaterals, lighter agenda. So I'm very much looking forward to just be there and have time to talk to people and choose the events that I would like to attend to, because often you were running into someone that you really wanted to talk to, but then you had some plans and the day kind of disappeared in that. I can't think of a funny story. No pressure, Kajsa, you have to do it for me.
It's all up to you now. The whole panel is resting on this.
No, same here. Also, first time not as a minister. You had such a packed schedule. You didn't run into everybody. You were running after yourself. But I do remember 2022. Because I came here and one of the persons I wanted to meet, and I had scheduled a meeting with him, was the then Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Oleksiy Reznikov. And that never happened. But we did speak to each other on the phone when I was still here, and he was on his way to the plane, and we didn't hear one another properly. And he said, "Just call me Alex," because I didn't understand his name. So it was completely messed up situation. But I will never forget it, because only days after, then of course this large scale war broke out. I did meet them with your former colleague Kuleba. Dimitri, exactly. And I spoke to Oleksiy on the phone, and which helped, because then after that I could speak to him on a regular basis. And eventually I went to Ukraine and saw him there for the very first time. But it was, it's something I will not forget.
Actually, the last time I was here was 2 years ago when Zelenskyy came, and it was supposed to be maybe his last time out of Ukraine for a while. And I was just telling the story, but there was a mistake with my ticket. And I ended up having an extra day in Munich, and I had a lovely day. I went shopping, I did some spa, and then it's Munich, of course. And my phone went off at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the war had started, and I spent the next 6 weeks in Poland and Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So hopefully I won't start any more wars. We won't start any more wars this time. We're wrapping up, but I do want to ask you, just to end on this note, I can't remember who said it, but when I was trying to be a foreign correspondent, a war correspondent, I remember a woman, I think she's from the New York Times, she said, "I always found being a woman in war zones to actually be an advantage, because you can go into spaces your male colleagues can't go into. People are not threatened by you. You can slip into places more unnoticed. But when you have to deal with someone on a professional basis, for the most part, they will treat you like a professional and kind of put your gender aside most of the time." And she said, overall, she found it to be a net gain in journalism. I'm wondering, in the foreign affairs space, how does that play? Have you had situations where you felt like, damn it, I wish I was just a dude? Or do you find being a woman, for the most part, is an advantage if you know how to use it?
I think it's overall the second part, I would say. I think it's also a matter of mindset. It's a matter of, how are you going to approach this? Are you going to approach it like, are you going to somehow pretend you're a man to try to, fit in the role better? Or are you just not? Are you going to... And that goes with, how you speak, what kind of words you use, being more compassionate than not.
But do you think about this, both of you, when you're picking out what to wear, how much makeup you're putting on, whether you're going to wear heels, whether you're not? Does that factor in?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I never wear black in family photos, for example, ever. Always in colors, because the majority are men in dark blue or black. So I, instead of looking almost like them, I'm obviously not a man, and I'm not yet old. And what you see is what you get. But also in your speeches, in the way when you have an opportunity to speak with someone or talk around big tables, I mean NATO or whatever it is, I really do that as a 37-year-old woman, not trying to fit in. But of course, there's also a difference between when you're speaking in. It depends on cultures as well. In certain circumstances, you can sense, maybe not by words, but you can sense that there's a difference. But in our region, I think it's an advantage, and I think it's also. I actually think it's also a good idea for governments that wanna have that advantage to pick competent women to do the job.
Yeah, well, when I was Minister of Defense, when I started out, I think there were 8 of us in the NATO meetings. I think there are about 3 or 4 today. So you do stand out because there are not so many. I think that you can use it to your advantage. That's absolutely true. But at the same time, I think in general, you have to, perhaps not when you're a minister, because you have the position. You represent your country. If you're in Brussels, you represent your country, so they have to listen to you, man, woman, whatever. Doesn't really matter. But in general, also before that, in your career, you have to make an effort, and sometimes more than men. But really, I don't think so much about clothes. Or I do remember when I had two very, very tall colleagues. One of them was called Mark Rutte.
You're very tall.
I used to. No, I always wore heels because I didn't want to be too much smaller than he was. But apart from that, not so much thinking. I agree with the family photo. That's also an advantage. That can help you, but I think it's only I do notice it that there are so few of them in these defense circles. That's really I think that I don't really understand it. I've seen while I was there that it's become a more important position in most governments because of the war and because of security and defense is so high on the political agenda. So I saw there were
and then
more.
The women get. Then there are fewer.
So that was my question. Is that the reason that there are fewer women? Because now more of them are deputy prime ministers. And we even had, they used to transition from defense to foreign affairs. And now they transition the other way around, which is also interesting. So I'd have to look into it a little bit closer if it has any relation.
But it's also interesting because because in Iceland we don't have an army. So when you're a minister for foreign affairs, you're also minister of defense. So I was the only one, doing both of those meetings, and it was often quite similar, the numbers of women. But then in the leaders' meetings, there were like 3. So on the level above, so
each tier there are a few. Each tier up there are fewer.
Yeah. So if it doesn't change, it will take 1,000 years.
Let's hope not. So what can make MSC this year a success? Just briefly from both of you. When will you go home and think that was a good conference?
Well, it's of course going to be a very interesting conference. We're going to have the Vice President of the United States. It's going to be interesting to hear what he has to say. Will he repeat what he said earlier, or is going to repeat what we've heard this week from President Trump and the Secretary of Defense, or it's going to amend it a little bit, seeing now that the response is not very positive. So I think that's going to be very, very interesting. And I really hope, for me, it would be a success if the European countries show this unity that we talked about and show resolve in their support for Ukraine, resolve in strengthening European defense, boosting European defense industry, really working together on this and acknowledging that this is really could be a really pivotal moment in time. We have to do that. So that would be the success for me. So I'm curious about the United States, but I'm hopeful, and I hope not to be disappointed that Europe will step up its game.
Yeah, I think Munich Security Conference is always a success because it always matters so much. I mean, everyone is here, and it's always extremely interesting, and there's always something big happening right before and during, and so it's always a success in that respect. But I agree with that fact that a strong European voice. It will be interesting to hear what J.D. Vance, Vice President, will say. And I also, of course, it would be a success if we reach a point where we are moving in the right direction, where we have, dialogues and success stories between meetings. Because, I only came here first in 22, just days before the full-scale invasion. Then 23, it was just before the big summer in Ukraine. Last year, it was a lot about